With trembling hands, he took out not a book, nor a precious item. It was a wooden comb. The comb was old, the wood darkened with age, but still intact. Carved on its body were two tiny words, clumsily but lovingly etched, Leo, Ilara. Old Finn placed the comb in Ethan's palm. Then, he pointed to the comb, then to his own chest, and then looked out at the sea. His mouth moved, trying to form a sound. Ethan understood. The old man wasn't in Gwyn. He was a descendant of Leo, the crippled fisherman from a century ago. And old Finn was the guardian of his ancestors' last token of love. Old Finn took Ethan's hand and pulled him outside, to the water's edge. Using a finger, he began to draw on the damp sand. The lines were simple, crude, but they told a story clearer than 1,000 words. He drew a man and a woman holding hands. He drew another, larger, more malicious figure separating them. He drew the man being beaten. And then, he drew a boat and a figure falling into the sea. But next to that falling figure, he didn't draw ordinary waves. He drew whirlpools, and from those whirlpools, countless ghostly arms reached up, as if the deep sea itself had risen to embrace Ilara, to become one with her agony. It was a detail Silas Phan's journal had never mentioned. He had only seen Ilara throw herself into the sea. But from the perspective of the villagers, of the witnesses, it wasn't a simple suicide. It was a sacrifice. Ilara hadn't just died. She had been transformed. Suddenly, old Finn stopped. He looked up at Ethan, his eyes pleading. He pointed at the drawing on the sand, then towards Serpent's point in the distance. Then, he did something that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He pointed to his own heart, then made a motion of pulling it out and offering it to the sea. A sacrifice? Ethan whispered. You mean? There has to be another sacrifice to atone for the sin. Old Finn nodded frantically, his old eyes welling with tears. The word sacrifice rang in Ethan's head like a death knell. He took a step back, nearly stumbling. His entire body went cold, though the sun was high and the sand was hot. No, he shook his head, his voice frantic. No way. You can't mean that. There has to be another way. Rebuild a shrine. Hold a big ceremony. I can pay a lot of money to perform any kind of ritual. Ethan spoke like a madman, trying to apply modern solutions to an ancient, supernatural problem. But old Finn just looked at him, his expression unchanged. That same tragic resolve. He slowly shook his head, rejecting all of Ethan's proposals. Then he pointed to the sea again, a firm, powerful gesture, as if to say that the final judge was not him, but the great and wrathful entity out there. Unable to bear it any longer, Ethan turned and walked away. He didn't say goodbye. He just walked, slowly at first, then almost running, fleeing from the old man's gaze, from the drawing on the sand, and from that terrible suggestion. He heard the waves crashing behind him, and this time, it sounded like a demonic laugh, a laugh echoing up from the depths. Ethan returned to the ancestral hall in a state of turmoil. He slammed his door shut, ignoring the worried questions of his father and Nelson outside. He needed to be alone. He needed to think. Sacrifice? How ridiculous. This was the 21st century. People flew to space, created artificial intelligence. How could an ancient curse be lifted by a barbaric, medieval act? Old Finn must be old and senile. Or maybe, his hatred for the Fan family ran so deep that he proposed an impossible solution just to torture him mentally. Ethan desperately clung to these rational thoughts. He paced his room, trying to convince himself there was a logical explanation for everything. The face in the waves was an illusion. The stories in the journal were the ravings of a madman. Old Finn was a pitiful old man obsessed with the past. But what about the wet footprints Silas Fan wrote about? What about the deaths of the children? And the death of his Uncle Ben? Ethan collapsed onto the bed, clutching his head. The wall of reason he had so carefully constructed was cracking badly. He felt he was on the verge of madness, where reality and illusion merged into one. Ethan stayed in his room until evening. He didn't eat or drink, just sat motionless like a statue. As night fell, the silence of the old house became terrifying. Every little sound was amplified. The gnawing of termites in the beams sounded like breaking bones. The wind whistling through the roof tiles sounded like someone whispering. And then, he heard the sound of dripping water. Drip. 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 A steady, slow sound, coming from the corner of the room. Ethan turned on the light. The sound was coming from a corner where a long-dead potted plant sat. There was no faucet, no pipe nearby. He walked over and touched the floor. Bone dry. But the dripping sound continued, right next to his ear. Drip. 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 Goosebumps erupted all over his skin. He stood still, listening intently. The sound didn't seem to come from any specific location. It was everywhere, in the air, inside his head. And with the dripping, a familiar scent began to spread. The smell of sea salt and rotting seaweed. The smell of Serpent's Point. He backed away, his back hitting the wall. His heart pounded wildly. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, but his voice trembled. He decided to go out to the main hall to find his father. Being with someone else might be better. He opened the door and stepped into the long, dark corridor. The old house was lit by only a few dim oil lamps, creating eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. In the middle of the corridor hung a large, wood-framed mirror, its surface slightly clouded with age. As he walked past, Ethan glanced at his reflection out of habit. And he froze. The person in the mirror was not him. For a brief moment, the reflection was of a woman. She wore a long white dress, soaking wet. Her long black hair was plastered to her pale face, partially hiding her eyes. Water dripped from her hair, from her clothes, onto the floor. She was looking at him, an emotionless, cold gaze, like the winter sea. Ethan screamed and fell backward. He blinked rapidly. When he looked in the mirror again, it was only his own reflection, his face pale with terror. No. It can't be. He had really seen it. Trembling, he got up, not daring to look at the mirror again. He ran towards the main hall. "Dad!" he called, his voice breaking. But before he could reach it, he stopped short. On the old wooden floor in front of him, where just a second ago had been completely dry, a wet footprint had appeared. Then another. And another. A line of small, bare footprints, soaked in seawater and covered in sand, was slowly appearing, one step at a time, as if an invisible person was walking from the mirror towards him. Ethan stood frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. He could only watch in horror as the footprints slowly approached. They stopped right at the tips of his shoes. The air around him suddenly turned ice cold. He could feel a presence right in front of him. A cold breath on his face, carrying the pungent smell of the deep sea. He felt as if icy fingers were lightly caressing his cheek. Then, from the darkness at the end of the corridor where the footprints began, a figure slowly materialized. It was her. Ilara. This time, it wasn't an illusion, not a reflection. She stood there, in the flesh, or at least in some visible form of matter. Her entire body was drenched, water still streaming down to the floor, forming a small puddle. Her long hair hid most of her face, revealing only purple lips and a part of her pale chin. She didn't look at him, just stood motionless, her head slightly bowed. Her silence was more terrifying than any scream. Ethan wanted to run, but his feet felt nailed to the floor. He wanted to close his eyes, but couldn't. He was forced to witness this horrifying scene. Then, she slowly raised her head. Her face was deathly white, swollen like a person who had been drowned for a long time. But the most terrible thing was her eyes. They weren't empty as he had seen in the illusion. They were wide open, bloodshot, with no whites, only the red of blood and hatred. And from the corners of her eyes, not tears, but two streams of dark seawater were trickling down her white dress. She opened her mouth, and a voice not of this world echoed, a mix of the wind whistling through Serpent's Point and water flowing in a deep cave. Give it back. Just 3 words, but they struck Ethan's mind like a hammer. He staggered, his head spinning. Give it back to me. The form of the weeping maiden began to blur, dissolving into the air like mist, leaving only the puddle of seawater on the floor and the slowly drying footprints. Ethan collapsed, vomiting violently. All his skepticism, all his denial, had been shattered into pieces. This was real. The curse was real. And the weeping maiden was here, in this very house. She was no longer waiting out at sea. She had come to collect her debt. Ethan had no other choice. Running was futile. Denial was suicide. He had only one path. He had to face it. He had to understand the true meaning of the word sacrifice. The wave of nausea passed, leaving a sour, bitter taste in Ethan's mouth. He remained kneeling on the floor, his body trembling, his mind a void. The puddle of seawater and the footprints had vanished as if they had never existed, but their chill and stench seemed to have soaked into every plank and brick of the ancient house. Arthur, Fan and Nelson rushed in at the sound of the commotion. Seeing Ethan's devastated state, Arthur didn't need to ask what had happened. His face turned ashen, his shoulders slumped as if he had aged a decade in an instant. She has already got inside the house, he said, his voice a whisper, like a grim prophecy fulfilled. It's over. It's really over. Ethan didn't respond. He staggered to his feet, using the wall for support. He looked at his father, not with blame, but with the look of a comrade in despair. They were no longer father and son. They were the last two descendants of a cursed bloodline, facing judgment together. "Give it back," Ethan mumbled, repeating the weeping maiden's words. She said, "Give it back." But give back what? A life? Love? How can we give back those things? His question hung in the heavy air of the hall, unanswered. Arthur just shook his head, his face etched with the helplessness he had carried his entire life. That night, no one in the ancestral hall slept. They sat together in the main room, lighting every lamp they could find, as if light could dispel the darkness that had thickened in their souls. Ethan had regained some composure. The peak of terror had passed, replaced by a cold determination. If he was to die, he would not die in ignorance and fear. He opened Silas Phan's journal again. This time, he wasn't reading for the story. He was searching for a clue. He mulled over every sentence, every word. Give it back. If it wasn't something intangible like life or happiness, it had to be something tangible. Something his great-great-grandfather had stolen. He read and reread the descriptions of Alara, of her possessions. But she was just the daughter of a poor fisherman. Her most valuable assets were likely her voice and her beauty. He read about Leo, but he too was just a fisherman with empty hands. It wasn't until nearly dawn, when his eyes were sore and the words began to dance before him, that Ethan paused at a short entry in the appendix at the end of the book. This section didn't tell a story. It was just scattered notes by Silas Phan on feng shui and binding rituals, likely written during his frantic years of trying to fight the curse. The land has a spirit, the water has a god. Serpent's Point is where the spiritual energy of the sea converges, a place of harmony between yin and yang. The fishermen worship it, considering it sacred ground. They believe the sea blessed them with prosperity through this land. To truly possess the land, one cannot just own the deed, but must capture its spirit. One must use an object imbued with the owner's potent lifeblood as a binding charm, to sever its connection to the sea god and make it one's own. Thus, the spiritual energy will follow the new master, and fortune will flow to his house. Ethan's heart pounded. An object imbued with potent lifeblood. A binding charm. His great-great-grandfather hadn't just stolen the daughter of the sea. He had used a dark ritual to steal the sacred land of the fishing village, severing their spiritual contract with the ocean. It was a dual transgression. Give it back. Perhaps. It meant giving back the land itself. But how? A land deed was just a piece of paper. What the weeping maiden wanted was likely the freedom of Serpent's Point's spiritual energy. To do that, he had to find and destroy the binding charm. "Dad," Ethan turned to his father, who was dozing in his chair. "Do you know anything about great-great-grandfather using something to bind the land at Serpent's Point?" Arthur startled awake. He looked at Ethan, his expression hazy. "A binding charm? I don't know. I only heard the elders whisper that Serpent's Point has been our family's land for a very long time, and no one was allowed to go near it." Ethan was disappointed, but he didn't give up. He knew who to ask. The next morning, the sky over Stillwater Cove was no longer clear. Dark clouds had gathered from nowhere, churning above the sea. The ocean was no longer emerald green but had turned a menacing, slate gray. The wind began to blow harder, carrying a cold, damp spray. Even the most experienced fishermen rushed to pull their boats ashore, their faces filled with anxiety. "A storm is coming," one old fisherman said to another, his voice worried. "But it's strange. This isn't the storm season. This storm, it smells of the deep sea. Like the weeping maiden storm from the old tales." Ethan paid no mind to the storm. He went straight to old Finn's shack. The old man was also hurriedly reinforcing his flimsy roof. Seeing Ethan, he just looked at him in silence. Ethan didn't waste words. He took a stick and drew a square in the sand, representing Serpent's Point. Then, he drew a figure, Silas Fan, burying a small box in the middle of the square. He circled the box and looked at old Finn, his eyes pleading. Old Finn stared at the drawing. His eyes narrowed. He stood motionless for a long time, as if searching through a distant, ancient memory. Then, a flash of recognition lit up his eyes. He nodded slowly. He knew. He grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him along. He didn't lead him to Serpent's Point. He led him deeper into the village, to a small, ruined temple under the shade of an ancient banyan tree. The temple was dedicated to an unknown deity, perhaps a sea god or a local guardian spirit. Old Finn stopped in front of the temple, pointing to the faded stone reliefs. On them were carved ancient legends. He pointed to one relief depicting a god granting the villagers a small chest. In another, an evil figure was stealing that chest and burying it. But what caught Ethan's attention was the final relief. It depicted the villagers trying to dig up the object. But surrounding them was a terrifying tempest, with giant waves that seemed to want to swallow everything. "The storm," Ethan muttered. "To retrieve the binding charm, one must face the storm." Old Finn nodded, his expression grave. He pointed to the sky, which was growing darker by the minute. The weeping maiden storm. It wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was the curse's final defense mechanism. It was the wrath of the sea, rising to protect the desecration that had been buried. A wave of despair washed over Ethan. How could one man fight a storm? He turned to look at old Finn, but the old man was pointing in another direction. Towards the Fan family's ancestral hall. He pointed there, then at Ethan, and then once more made the gesture of sacrifice, of pulling out his heart. Ethan froze. He understood. The binding charm was buried with the lifeblood of Silas Fan. Perhaps it could only be found and destroyed by someone carrying the blood of Silas Fan. And the price was not just the courage to face the storm. The price was likely the very sacrifice old Finn had spoken of. Not a literal death, but a willingness to sacrifice, an atonement with one's own lifeblood to absolve the sins of an ancestor. The wind howled, stronger now. The first heavy, cold drops of rain began to fall. The storm was closing in. Ethan knew he didn't have much time. He had to return to the most terrifying place, the origin of all this tragedy. He had to go to Serpent's Point, not to build, but to dig. to dig up the sins of his ancestor before the wrath of the sea consumed everything. The weeping maiden storm arrived like no other the village had ever witnessed. The wind didn't just blow, it shrieked, howling through the houses and trees like the cries of a million tormented souls. Rain didn't fall, it lashed down horizontally, sharp and cold as shards of glass. The sea roared in fury, waves as high as houses crashing deep inland, sweeping away small boats and fishing racks. The entire village of Stillwater Cove was plunged into darkness and terror. People bolted their doors, huddling in their fragile homes, listening to the ocean's rage and praying. They knew this was no ordinary storm. This was the sea, coming to collect an old debt. Inside the ancestral hall, Ethan stood up. He wore practical clothes and a thick raincoat. In his hand, he held a small but sturdy pickaxe. He was ready. Arthur Fan stood at the door, watching his son. The deep-seated fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by an unprecedented resolve. He no longer tried to stop his son. He knew this was the family's destiny, and Ethan was the one chosen to bear it. "Be careful," was all Arthur could say, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped forward and placed a small, cold object in his son's hand. It was the family's heirloom jade ring, an object that his great-great-grandfather Silas Fan had never taken off. "It shares the same lifeblood. Maybe it will help you." Ethan clenched the ring. He nodded to his father, a nod that said everything. Then he opened the door and stepped into the raging storm. The journey to Serpent's Point was a battle with death itself. The wind was strong enough to tear him from the ground. Rain lashed his face, blinding him. He had to crawl, to cling to every tree and rock to move forward. The entire world seemed to be trying to stop him. The screams of the weeping maiden were everywhere, mixed with the wind, whispering curses and taunts into his ear. When he finally reached Serpent's Point, the scene was even more horrifying. This was the eye of the storm. Waves crashed against the cliffs, sending spray dozens of meters into the air. Lightning split the black sky, illuminating the dark, jagged rocks like the fangs of a demon. Ethan felt Alara's presence more strongly than ever. She was in every gust of wind, every drop of rain, every wave. All of Serpent's Point trembled with her fury. He had to find the binding charm. But where, in this chaos? Ethan closed his eyes, trying to block out the screaming storm. He focused on the feeling of his great-great-grandfather's ring in his palm. He let the blood in his veins, the blood of the sinner, guide him. A strange impulse, a cold energy, pulled him toward the highest point of the cape, near a gnarled, windswept sea trumpet tree. This was it. This was the place. Ethan began to dig. The pickaxe struck the hard, rocky ground. Every swing was a struggle. The wind felt like an invisible hand trying to rip the tool from his grasp. Illusions flashed before his eyes. He saw Leo being beaten to a pulp. He saw Alara standing on the boat's railing with that ghastly smile. He heard the mournful lullaby. "Get out!" Ethan roared, his voice lost in the storm. He wouldn't let them distract him. He poured all his strength, all his remorse, into every swing of the pickaxe. Clank! The pickaxe hit something hard. Elated, Ethan dropped to his knees and dug with his hands. Beneath the earth was a small, green-tarnished bronze chest. The moment he pulled the chest from the ground, the storm seemed to intensify. A monstrous wave crashed against the cliff just below him. And from the sea foam, the weeping maiden materialized, clearer and more terrifying than ever. She floated in mid-air, her long black hair whipping in the wind like a nest of serpents. Her blood-red eyes, filled with a century of hatred, bored into him. Ethan did not back down. He knew this was the decisive moment. He forced the chest open. Inside was not gold or jewels. Only a lock of black hair tied with a red thread, and a small piece of goatskin parchment, on which were written the two words Van Tin in a dark, dried blood-like ink. A blood pact. This was the charm used to sever the spirit of the land. The weeping maiden let out a terrifying shriek that seemed to shake the very heavens. She lunged at Ethan. "This does not belong to the Fan family." Ethan screamed, his voice rising above the storm. "Let the descendant atone for the ancestor's sin." He pulled out the small knife he had brought and, without hesitation, sliced a deep gash across his palm. Fresh blood welled up immediately. He let the drops of his blood, the blood of repentance, fall onto the lock of hair and the blood packed in the chest. "I, Ethan Fan, descendant of Silas Fan, offer my blood to break this curse. I return freedom to you, and to this land." As Ethan's blood touched the binding charm, the chest emitted a plume of black smoke. The lock of hair and the parchment burst into flames, turning to ash in an instant. The weeping maiden stopped short in front of Ethan. Her shriek died. The rage in her red eyes slowly faded. Ethan grabbed the now empty chest and staggered to the edge of the cliff, to the very spot where he sensed Alara had jumped. He raised the chest high and threw it far out into the churning sea below. A strange silence fell. The moment the chest hit the water, the storm abruptly stopped. The wind died. The rain ceased. The giant waves calmed, returning to a gentle swell. The black sky parted, revealing the vibrant streaks of sunset. And the weeping maiden was still there, in front of Ethan. But she had changed. Her form became translucent, ethereal. Her swollen, pale face transformed back into the beautiful countenance of the young Alara. Her blood-red eyes were now clear, filled with an immense sadness. The hatred had been washed away, leaving only pain. She looked at Ethan, no longer with hatred. She gave a slight nod, a nod of acceptance, of release. Then she smiled, a sad but serene smile. Her form slowly dissolved into the air like mist, merging with the brilliant sunset. The moaning on Serpent's Point had fallen silent. 1 year later, the fishing village of Stillwater Cove had rediscovered its inherent peace. The sea was gentle once more, blessing the villagers with bountiful seasons of fish and shrimp. People no longer spoke of Serpent's Point with fear. It had returned to being a wild and majestic landscape. Ethan did not build the resort. Instead, he used his own money to help the villagers restore the ancient temple, returning worship to the forgotten gods. Arthur Fan, too, had found peace in his final years. The fear that had haunted his entire life had finally vanished. This afternoon, Ethan walked alone on Serpent's Point. He stood at the cliff's edge, looking out at the vast ocean. The scar on his palm remained, a permanent reminder of the price of atonement. The sea breeze blew gently, caressing his hair. He no longer heard the mournful cries. He heard only the gentle lapping of the waves, the whistle of the wind through the rocks. The sounds of nature, of peace. The curse was broken. The vengeful spirit was free. But the story of the weeping maiden, of love and hatred, of sin and retribution, will forever be a part of this land, retold by the waves for 1,000 years to come. I hope you had a terrifying experience with today's story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on other horror videos. Goodbye, and see you again soon.